Hello and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
And today we're pleased to welcome back onto the show Noah Tetzner of the History of Vikings podcast. He's one of our original friends of the show, definitely a big supporter of the show right from the beginning, and we'd be happy to get involved with him and all the other podcasts in our kind of little Viking community. So that's going to be fantastic. We've certainly been looking forward to having Noah back on.
Absolutely. It's been a long time coming. It's been a few months since we've talked with Noah. That's for sure.
Definitely, almost a year, and I think we're actually both celebrating mutual anniversaries here fairly shortly. So we'll be sure to talk about that right before we get Noah back onto the show officially here. Just our usual couple of things of housekeeping. I'll keep it brief so we can get him on here as soon as possible here. So again, as usual, you can get in touch with us on social media. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Northern Myths Podcast. We also have our YouTube channel. You can get in touch with us there, Northern Myths Podcast. And the big thing for us now is that we are on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, that is the best way you can do that. And we do our best to create as much value for you if you choose to support us on Patreon. So check out our page, patreon.com/northernmyths, and we would definitely appreciate it if you'd like to donate. Other than that, we'll save the rest for the end. That's how you can get in touch with us and support us if you like. So I think without further ado, Noah, welcome onto the show.
Thank you so much for having me back, Luke and Dan. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely it is. It's been quite a year, and it's been awesome to get to know you throughout this whole time.
Yeah, same with you guys. I mean, I think it's so cool that we're celebrating sort of mutual anniversaries here. We started really around the same time, and I think it's really exciting how we've been able to help each other along the way. But today is actually the official 1-year anniversary of the History of Vikings. So 1 year ago today, I would have just gotten approved by iTunes and all of the other podcast directories, but I couldn't think of a better way to celebrate the anniversary. So I'm so excited to really get talking with you both today.
Yes, well, happy anniversary. If we kind of have cake because it's a podcast and we're not in the same room, but at least in spirit, the cake is here.
Yeah, congratulations on that. Is there anything within this whole entire year that maybe you're most proud of having achieved?
Man, well, I can't believe it's only been a year. I would say this is definitely, it's both been a long year and a short year at the same time. I suppose the days were long, but the year in itself was really short. And I mean that in the best possible way because I've loved every minute of it. Just sort of doing a little self-reflection, I had been wanting to start a history podcast quite some time before I actually launched the History of Vikings. And I settled upon this idea of, well, why don't I do a podcast about sort of the Viking Age and Norse mythology and that whole sort of thing. And I didn't know that it would actually turn into an interview show, whereas every episode features a discussion with someone. But that's been what I love most about the podcast is every episode having the opportunity to talk with so many cool people, whether it be professors from the University of Iceland talking about some of the Icelandic sagas, or it be professors of medieval history from places like Oxford and Yale, or whether it be, fellow podcasters like yourself, kindred spirits who really get excited and passionate about these mythologies, various authors. I would say what I'm most proud of in the History of Vikings is all of the conversations that I've been able to record and that I'll always have. I actually really enjoy editing my own podcast episodes because it's like I'm getting sort of a private history lesson twice every time I do that. And I just think it's so cool that I have all of these conversations sort of on a log there that people can go back and listen to at any time, really. But I've loved every minute of this past year.
I think I feel similarly about the conversations. You got them forever, right? Because some of the folks that we've gotten to talk to over the last year or so here, I mean, they've been really cool people. The people you've talked to have been some really cool people, and the whole thing is sometimes when I'm thinking like, wow, we've actually gotten to talk to these people, and then you can actually go back and listen to it again, and it's like, wow, that actually happened. It's a pretty cool feeling. So since we last spoke, do you have any big news or any big things that you'd like to share with our listeners? And any sort of introduction as well, just for those who haven't heard about the show before. Although, again, yeah, I think many of our listeners are probably listeners of your show as well.
Mm. So, for those who aren't familiar, I host the History of Vikings podcast, which is really dedicated to exploring every aspect of the Viking Age and Norse myth and Icelandic sagas and all of the primary sources that go along with all of those topics in history and literature. Every episode features a discussion with, a lot of times it's a scholar from a university whose research and work has focused a great deal on the subject matter for that episode. Other times it's people who are really doing some exciting things. They're really bringing these topics in history and literature back to life in the modern world. That's just kind of who I am and what I do through the History of Vikings podcast. I guess the big one for me is most recently I've written a study guide to the Poetic Edda. It's available on Amazon, and it's just called The Poetic Edda, a study guide by Noah Tetzner, myself, obviously. And, I had this idea to write the study guide for the Poetic Edda because, as on your show, that's a primary source, which really comes up a lot. I mean, it is one of the most crucial sources that we have for Norse mythology. It's a collection of medieval Icelandic poems dealing with the Norse gods and their human heroes. A lot of people don't really know where to start with the Poetic Edda and with some of these medieval primary sources. Since this is a collection of many different poems written down in many different places and many different times by many different people, some of the stories don't always agree with each other, especially when compared to other sources that we have for Norse mythology. So, I thought, why don't I just create a Cliff Notes-esque book that deals with the Poetic Edda, and it just breaks the Poetic Edda down stanza by stanza, summarizing it nicely, really presenting the concrete facts that we do have and relating the poems to one another. But really just the History of Vikings podcast and then the Poetic Edda study guide, my new book. Those are really the two big ones these days.
Well, that's really exciting that you've got this new book out. I think that's kind of a dream for podcasters, right? Is to turn what they're doing into a book.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's fantastic that in the time that you've been doing the show, you've managed to take what you've learned and put it into something that hopefully is accessible to your audience to be able to better appreciate the Poetic Edda. And I mean, we are big fans of the Poetic Edda, and appreciating the Poetic Edda can be a tough go. So that's fantastic that you've been able to create something that is a contribution for readers who would be interested in learning more about these mythologies.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure writing it because doing something, I think it's close to 50 podcast episodes now on the History of Vikings, all of which were interviews and many of which deal with the Poetic Edda and Norse mythology. I really got to get some sort of one-on-one teaching about these myths and these poems. And apart from that, sort of my independent research, reading the various translations and the dictionaries to Norse mythology available, and some of the sagas. The saga of the Volsungs primarily is the one that encompasses similar stories to the Poetic Edda, dealing with heroes like Helgi and Sigurd, and Fafnir the dragon, and the dragon's horde, and the otter's ransom, and so on and so forth. It's just been a pleasure writing this, and I think it's really cool that, yeah, like you said, Dan, I could take everything I've learned through my podcast and put it in the form of written word. But yeah, I've loved every minute of it, and I really do hope it helps people understand the Poetic Edda a little better.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and I'm really glad that it's been so fulfilling for you. Maybe I'll ask another kind of question along those lines. What has been, either since we last spoke or kind of just in general, what has been some of the experiences that you've had that you find to have been most valuable for you in this process?
Hmm. I've just learned so much through doing this podcast, just so much about history, and not just the Viking Age and this period and sort of early medieval history, and not just, about mythologies and how those work and looking at them in certain ways. But I've really learned a lot about myself. If I look at Noah Tetzner before the history of Vikings and I look at Noah Tetzner now, sort of after and during the history of Vikings, I mean, it's two separate people. I would say my love of learning has just grown so exponentially through doing this podcast, through doing interviews, and really diving into these books and reading and writing the questions for the interviews and the notes and listening to the interviews that I myself have conducted. That's been so fulfilling. Another thing that's been so fulfilling, and this is closely related to the interviews I've done, is getting to meet so many cool people through my podcast. People that I can really call, sort of my friends. That's just been so incredible. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Jorvik Viking Festival in York, United Kingdom. And that was so cool because I was in touch, for quite some time with the sort of directors of the Jorvik Viking Center, which is a museum in York, UK, built atop the archaeological excavation known as the Coppergate Dig of the 1970s and 80s. And that's where they were building a shopping center, sort of a shopping mall in York. And sort of the rule in many European countries before you build anything is you have to take a look at the archaeology, because those countries are so old and are so rich in history. You have to make sure you're not damaging any potential archaeological finds. And sure enough, there were so many remains of not only the Viking Age, but also the Roman times. So, one of my favorite things, it was such a memorable experience a few weeks ago, is I got to have lunch with a man by the name of Dr. Peter Addyman. He's he's a older gentleman. I believe he's in his upper 70s now, but it was so cool because he was the one who really spearheaded and led the Coppergate dig of the 1970s and 80s. And he was so kind, as after we had lunch, he gave my dad attended the festival with me, a personal tour of the entire city of York, walking along the city walls from the Middle Ages and certain sections even going back to the Roman times. But as we were walking throughout the city, he could not only tell us about the history behind the buildings we were seeing, but he could also tell us the history of the things we couldn't see. That is, the things that are still beneath the ground and they're still finding things and they're still being excavated. But yeah, the ability to meet people in real life, that I've met through my podcast, and even the people I haven't had the pleasure of meeting in real life, just the friendships and this idea of us all getting excited about the same things has been so fulfilling for me.
You brought up the Jorvik Viking Fest. I think you're gonna have to tell us all about that. It sounds like it'd be a great time.
Yeah, it really was. So yeah, I went a few weeks ago. It was mid-February. I flew to York, UK, and so the city of York, for those who haven't been, is absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's kind of a picturesque medieval town. 13th century buildings. There's a wall, the city walls, that is the walls that were originally built from the Roman times. However, most of the sections of the wall have been restored. That goes around the entire perimeter of the city, and you can walk along that and get a beautiful view. There's the colossal Gothic cathedral, York Minster, which was worked over like 3 different centuries in the Middle Ages, directly in sort of the center of York. So it's just such a beautiful medieval city. And the Jorvik Viking Fest was so cool because you just have these different sort of events coming on. You have, various scholars reading, papers and giving talks. You have people dressed up in their historical Viking garb going on marches throughout the city. You have, living history, battle reenactments. One thing that I really enjoyed was touring the museum itself. I should say the Viking Center, Jorvik Viking Center, and how that's set up is it's actually a recreation of the Viking Age city of York. So you basically, once you enter the museum, you get on, they actually call it a ride, but it's meant in the best sense of that word, in that you get in sort of this little time capsule thing, and it drives you through a recreation of the Viking Age city. So there's animatronic wax figures, the sights, the smells. You're seeing an Arab traveler trading with someone. You're seeing different elements of people's houses and daily life, the different sort of shopkeepers, things they were selling, things they were trading, and really getting on sort of like a personal historical level. A lot of people in the city at the time, based on archaeological evidence of their bones, we were able to find out that they were not particularly healthy. So, you can see people with, just common symptoms like arthritis. But it's just incredible how, we can tell these personal details about these Vikings just based on what we found during these digs. But yeah, Jorvik Viking Festival, I highly recommend it. It was such a cool experience, and I've just fallen in love with the city of York really through going to the festival.
Well, it's a wonderful city in that it's got that Norse heritage. And it's fantastic that they celebrate it the way they do, because that could be a hard point in terms of history, the whole thing where the Vikings come down and conquer and all that. But it's pretty great that they celebrate that. And that reminds me of similar things out in the Orkney Islands, where they still have their Viking festivals there and things like that. And of course, if you go to, say, Norway or Iceland or anything like that, they have amazing history there as well. Getting to go to all of these places is really, really something valuable. And I didn't go to Norway through the podcast or anything like that. That was just a vacation when I went, but there were similar open air museums, and just getting to go to these places with all this history and to get to appreciate it even more. Would you say that you appreciate the history and the experience of York more because of your experiences on the podcast?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. Just, one thing that was really cool, as I mentioned, Dr. Peter Addingman, I actually had him as a guest on my show a few weeks before I left for York. So getting, to speak with him about the history of Viking Age York beforehand, and then actually touring the city and seeing it come to life was just so magical. Yeah, absolutely. I've gained such an appreciation for history on such a hands-on level, if that makes sense, through doing my podcast. But yeah, absolutely.
That's really neat. I'm quite jealous of listening to you talk about York. I was like, man, that is somewhere I would love to go and just soak in the history, like Roman and Viking and 13th century, all that stuff. I'd like totally here for. You'd mentioned in the museum that you went to that you saw a depiction of an Arabic man trading with some merchants in the Viking town. I was wondering if you could, give a little context for that. I noticed I think you've talked about it on your podcast as well, but some of our listeners might not be too familiar with, I guess, the extent of Viking trading and some of the stories associated with interactions with Vikings and Arab peoples.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so I guess the city of York during the Viking Age is really well known for being a great center of trade. It has a few rivers that run right through the city, and it would not have been uncommon to see people of all different ethnicities and nationalities in that city during the Viking Age. We know through various massive coin hoard findings that the Vikings were very much in touch with the Muslim and Arabic worlds of the Middle East, mainly the Caliphate at the time. And while basically, in terms of like understanding trade during the Viking Age and sort of the extent of just how the Vikings interacted with non-Scandinavians in the rest of the world, really, the one thing that's really remarkable about the Vikings is they were able to see so much of the world, and that's in part due to their innovative technologies in their longships, but also they were such great traders. We think of them as primarily raiders and sort of these barbaric, beastly warriors, but no, they were quite civilized indeed, and they were really masters of the sea and masters of trading. I did an interview with James Montgomery of the University of Cambridge not long ago, a few months ago on my podcast, and we talked about Ibn Fadlan. And Ibn Fadlan was an Arabic Muslim traveler. He wrote a book called The Journeys of Ibn Fadlan. Well, what is now a book, a collection of his written text, which is basically a travel log. And I don't remember how the story goes exactly. By story, I mean, this true historical event. But he was sent by, was it the Caliphate? Someone in the Middle East to travel through what is modern day Russia and deliver a message to a certain king over there, somebody who would have been closely related to, ethnically speaking, what are modern day Bulgarians. And he met a group of people along the way, which he called the Rus. Now, there's a lot of debate over really who the Rus were, but most scholars agree on the fact that they were Scandinavian in origin. And, he describes them as being people who had sort of dark images on their bodies, talking about what we think are tattoos, people who, prayed and worshipped wooden statues and in wooden pendants. And indeed, it is these people, the Rus, that the modern country of Russia gets its name from. So I guess in York, that Muslim traveler, although he was a trader, not really a traveler like Ibn Fadlan, is really closely related to that character of Ibn Fadlan, who's also featured in the popular movie The 13th Warrior.
That's right. I hadn't thought that until you just mentioned that. I've seen that movie many years ago. It's very good. I seem to remember liking it quite a bit. I think Antonio Banderas is Ibn Fadlan, and the name of the book it's based on, it's Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton, which is a pretty rockin' title for a book. But yeah, it's just awesome that the Norse were able to travel so far throughout the world because of their advanced boat technology. And it's kind of funny to think of, like, when we think of advanced technology, we're thinking like space travel and, the next iPhone or whatever. But at the time, like, having boats that could travel vast distances without sinking and being able to withstand storms at sea, all that kind of stuff, like, that's a big deal. So it's amazing to think of how far they were able to travel at the time because they had this incredible boat technology.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
So you mentioned about how starting this podcast has been something that has unlocked your love of learning. You've mentioned that was something that was kind of always active for you, but are there any other ways that you think this podcast has improved you or how you've grown as a person through putting on the History of Vikings podcast?
I mean, myself being sort of a younger guy, I think self-expression for some people is something that's really important. In fact, not just for some people, but for all people, and by self-expression, maybe that's not even the right word. I'm just talking about finding something that you love to do. History has always been my one true passion for my entire life. And I never really had too many friends or too many mentors or colleagues that really enjoyed history as much as I did before I started my podcast. But through my podcast, being able to have conversations with people who are history nerds and history buffs like me and love the same things I do, they live all over the world. And I've, as I mentioned, gotten the opportunity to meet a few of them in real life. That's been so inspiring. And on a personal level, I think my podcast has really helped with sort of my self-confidence as well. Just this idea of, this is who I am. This is what I do. I love history. I love mythology. I love literature. I love education, and really embracing that and wearing the history of Vikings as something that I do and who I am. Yeah, that's really helped with my self-confidence and really given me a sense of purpose and identity, if that makes sense. Not to get too sort of like philosophical or anything, but yeah, it's the truth.
No, that's incredibly important. And it's something that I think a lot of people these days struggle with in terms of having the confidence to go out into the world and to do something that is not only something that helps them to keep a roof over their head, but that gives meaning. It definitely sounds like you've found a lot of meaning through this show. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've found so much meaning through this show. just creating something that can be enjoyed by other people as well. I love hearing from listeners. I love, hearing what they like about the podcast, even some sort of constructive criticism, what they think could be improved. I love hearing things like that. I love hearing how it's, been a part of people's lives, something that I've created and something that I love to do. I love talking with people. They'll, ask me sort of about what I like to do, and I'll tell them about the history of Vikings, and they're like, yeah, that's so cool, and then I'll go off and do my thing, and then I might see them a few weeks later, and they're, hey, yeah, I was on my way up to wherever driving. I listened to this episode of your podcast, so it's like to think, here I am in my bedroom recording this podcast, which is being listened to all over the world in all different places, people's cars. I just got a message the other day saying, yeah, I was listening to your podcast as I was, laying carpet here in my dad's living room in Ireland, or it was something weird like that, but it was super cool. But yeah, it's definitely given me a sense of meaning, because I'm really interacting with so many people, even those people who I've never got the pleasure of speaking to or meeting. I'm still a part of their life, and they're still a part of mine, whether they know it or not.
That's something that I recall hearing just today. I was watching Jocko Willink on the Rubin Report, and it was a fantastic interview where Jocko said something like, and our listeners of the show may not know, but Jocko's a massive influence on our show because he sort of has this very action oriented method of talking about life, but he also grounds himself in a lot of the same principles that we talk about with mythology. But he was saying something like he's got a podcast, a really, really popular podcast with over 500 hours of content, something like that. And what he was saying today was that, well, it wasn't today, a couple of days ago it came out, but he said something to the effect of, well, if you have listened to me for 500 hours, you definitely know me. And you know what? That's definitely going to influence you as the listener. If you spent 500 hours listening to me speak, you're probably not going to listen to your wife talk for 500 hours. That was what he said, and that's really funny and actually probably true. And so yeah, it's crazy to think that I don't think either of our shows are quite at the 500-hour mark, but you know what, the people spending the time listening to our shows, that's like they're getting to know us, man. And it's always surreal to me to get those messages from people from all over the world saying they listen to the show and they appreciate it. And honestly, I find it as almost being like obligation isn't the word. It's more like responsibility of like, wow, like there's folks out there who actually like and appreciate this. Do you feel similarly?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you've hit the nail right on the head. Yeah, just podcasting is such a great medium as opposed to some other ways of, really getting the word out there about what you're excited about, whether it be, a YouTube channel or a blog, et cetera, et cetera. In that, sometimes people will ask me questions via email primarily, or they'll be like, yeah, you mentioned something in this podcast episode, and they'll quote the name of the podcast episode, and you mentioned this. Do with the Vikings of blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I totally forgot that I had even referenced that or mentioned that in, something that was like 10 episodes ago. But I think it's so cool that people are really engaged with what's being created and they're really excited about it and they're wanting to learn more. I find that when I do like book recommendations, like, yeah, hey guys, there's this new book on, Norse mythology or Snorri Sturluson, and I recommend it to people. I oftentimes get emails that have a lot to do with that because people, are sort of reading the things that we talk about on the podcast. And I know with you, with Northern Myths, you deal a lot with the Poetic Edda and the Kalevala. I think it's really cool how people can really follow along every week with the chapters, the poems, or the runos and the Kalevala that you're on at that time.
Yeah, we've gotten that from a lot of people ourselves too, and I think you're right about the recommending books and everything like that too, where it really turns into, here are the things that are influential for me or for us, and here's something you might like. And it's just humbling that you start to hear from people who are maybe going to go pick up that book or whatever. When we first started to get tweets and things of people who are buying the Poetic Edda by Jackson Crawford that we read, it's like, yeah, that's pretty cool. That's getting some really fantastic knowledge into more hands in front of more eyes. That's definitely really exciting. And do you have any big plans coming up for the future? Anything you've got that may be a little bit in the sense of growing the show or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm really excited for 2019. It's going to be a big year for the history of Vikings. I'm confident in that. Creating the study guide to the Poetic Edda was huge. I want to continue to create great content in the form of engaging interviews with knowledgeable guests. That's something that I'll never cease to do, and something that I really want to do more of this year. I really want to get into the Icelandic sagas. I really want to get into maybe some Heimskringlas, the sagas of the Norwegian kings. I've started to cover it in a few episodes, but I want to talk more about the history of Viking Age Iceland itself, sort of what made Iceland exceptional during the Viking Age. I would argue that it was basically, the new world of the Viking Age. Indeed, it is the place where, because of that, we get Snorri Sturluson, we get the Prose Edda, we get the Poetic Edda, we get the Icelandic sagas, and the list goes on and on. So I want to continue to do many great interviews. I want to continue and probably do more writing, whether it be articles for some history magazines that really share this history of the Vikings and Norse myth with people. And yeah, those are kind of my plans for 2019. I don't know really what all of that writing entails as of yet, but I know that I want to cover things that haven't been covered yet, and I think I want to start doing more podcast series, more things that people can follow along on. So I'll continue to do regular interviews, but then I might do some irregular things dealing with maybe a series on the Icelandic sagas or something like that.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun and very interesting. We'll be looking forward to it, that's for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So another question that we I think asked you the first time, but maybe you might have some new thoughts on now. Apart from what has helped you just through the process of podcasting and having these interviews and everything, these great conversations, there's also a large element of the mythology that underlies all of this great history and everything like that. And certainly I know just from interacting with you on all the social media and just our chats and everything like that, I know you really appreciate mythology as well. And of course, that's what our show is focused on. Is there anything about the mythology that you have taken into your life, or anything about the mythology that you would say is influential on you?
Yeah. I've often asked myself, why Norse mythology? Why is it so popular? Because it's undoubtable, this idea that Norse mythology is really sort of coming up to the surface, and there's a resurgence in popularity, whether it be best-selling books like Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology or his American Gods, or even the award-winning TV show on the History Channel, Vikings, where Norse mythology is mentioned regularly. Why is it so popular? Why is it so popular? I mean, I think part of it is that these are just such great stories, and that these stories are so timeless, but it must be deeper than that, I was thinking to myself. So I've come to the conclusion that in these myths, although the stories themselves can be rather elaborate, the principles and the underlying foundations of these myths are very primal, and they're very basic in a good way. Things like preparing for the winter and braving the cold, things like defending your family, defending your honor, being honest, men sort of protecting their spouses and protecting women, this idea of creating beautiful families. These are all, really basic concepts. And I think in a world that's getting increasingly busy, perhaps there's a part, at least in me anyways, maybe other people, a part of our souls that are really longing for something simpler and something a little quieter, something true, something purposeful. And I think that can be found in exploring these myths. And I certainly have experienced that on a personal level.
That's a great perspective. And I think finding meaning is certainly one of the reasons why we originally started exploring these stories. Exploring the meaning behind the stories is really what sparked the show, I think. And it's interesting hearing you say that you think there's sort of a resurgence going on and trying to go back to these ideas. Do you think there's a lack of these simpler ideas in modern society today?
I do. I really do. I mean, in terms of how fast paced the world is. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying, kids these days, they're always on their smartphones and social media. Not at all. But there's a lot of busyness, whether it be something like, working a 9 to 5 job, whether it be something like keeping up with the Joneses, as we say here in the United States, this idea of trying to impress others through physical items and through a display of wealth and through status symbols, which isn't inherently bad, but I'm saying things like that are all modern concepts which can really stress you out. I think it is certainly lacking in modern culture, and I think there are those of us who are just longing for something more real and more substantial and more true.
I would definitely agree with that. We seem to have gone into a very materialistic way of thinking, and I don't just mean that in like, oh, I need to have the newest, latest gadget or whatever, but in a real sense that I think our society doesn't think there's anything beyond like what we can see or measure. And I'm sure a lot of people will think like, oh, that's crazy woo-woo talk or whatever. But I think there is an aspect to humans that there's a soul, and that try as we might, we can't feed the human soul with the latest gadgets or the shiniest cars or anything like that. There's got to be something more to it. And I think these myths and stories and all the history of these are the things that have survived for so long because there's something real there that we can hold on to. It's not just a passing fancy. They're not impermanent. I know, like, in Buddhism and Hinduism, there's a big emphasis on focusing on permanent things rather than things that aren't permanent, that everything is an illusion, that kind of thing. But there is something at the core that is solid and real. And I think learning the history and going back to a time when there wasn't really all of this artifice. It was just, you had to deal with a whole bunch of real stuff because it would kill you. I think we look kind of romantic way, which sometimes is bad because, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we have now that, like, if they could have had at the time, like refrigerators or plumbing, like, holy crap, that's like a big deal, right? But like, I think there is sort of a romantic image of it, in that, what they had in life was virtually all real, and that the relationships had were tight and close because they depended on each other for survival, and just all of that real human connection interaction that maybe we're missing today because we're busy with video games and smartphones and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I really think you're onto something there, that maybe we're missing something that they had back then.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned sort of romanticism, and this is kind of a different sense of that word. But if one wanted to study, romances throughout history, be it the Middle Ages or even right up into the early 1900s, if you were to compare, stories of great romances, namely a man meeting a woman and falling in love and then spending the rest of their lives together and creating a family, how it was done throughout history is not at all how it's done nowadays, which is perfectly fine. But I just think that in terms of something so basic to human nature, like love and falling in love with someone, a lot of these material objects can get in the way of that and really are sort of roadblocks to that basic human understanding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there is something to that as well, where I know a lot of couples these days have met through apps, right? And never having met each other in person before deciding they want to go on a date, sort of thing. And of course, that's a great tool to start to bring more people together. And the social consequences of that are yet to be seen, but it is certainly bringing people together in a completely new way. But there is also something to, meeting the person that you end up being with in person. Like I met my wife on the bus, and we've been together for 9 years now, right? So it's quite something when that is the case. But what is the difference? And what is the difference if you meet someone in person or over the internet? Isn't that just a new way to communicate? And of course, back in the day, a lot of these marriages and relationships would have been completely arranged, right? So it's not as if love was always a factor. And the reasons behind why these marriages would have been arranged is also something that's up for debate and something we've tackled a couple of times through necessity. But well, it's fantastic that you see that sort of meaning coming from this sort of history, mythology, and all that. Do you have any other thought as to why you maybe have been so drawn to history from the beginning? Because that's interesting too.
Why have I always loved history? I mean, I don't know. My family, genetically speaking, certainly has a great appreciation for history, but none of them have really been as passionate about it and really lived it as I have. I think it's just been something that's always been a part of me, really been a part of my identity. Just this idea of appreciating, where you've come from and where we all have come from as human beings, the history of our nationalities, of our ethnicities, of our countries, of all of the really societal structures which exist, to me is just so fascinating. If I had one wish, which was to be granted, it would be the ability to travel back in time. No doubt. That would be just so fantastically awesome. I just have been obsessed with history and learning about how, what made people tick back then and how we've changed as human beings and how we've evolved emotionally and in terms of intellectually with different sort of political, but also like societal ideas, like philosophical things as well. Yeah, but I would say I'm an old soul. I've always had a great appreciation for the past.
Nothing wrong with that. I often feel the same way sometimes. And it's funny, my good friend Kyle has a similar desire to you, as to have a time machine sort of thing, but he always jokes that he would get back there. He's into languages as well, but he says he'd probably try the language that is closest to whatever time period he ends up in. They wouldn't understand him one bit, and then they would murder him because he can't do anything useful. But so that's why he tries to figure out, memorize as much history as possible, though maybe he could predict the future if he were lucky, but it probably wouldn't go so well.
Yeah, certainly. That's funny.
Have you done any of that genetic testing like 23andMe?
I haven't, but I've always wanted to, and I've thought a great deal about it. Have you guys?
I have. My wife got it for me for Christmas, and I got the results a few weeks ago, and there weren't any real surprises except more Spanish than I was expecting, which I was expecting zero. But yeah, no surprises, like 99% white bread, just DNA from all sorts of places in Europe. And I was like, kind of boring, I guess. I'm not, nothing too exciting, but nothing unexpected either.
Yeah, I figured that stuff would be just interesting, right? It's interesting to see where you've all come from and everything. I didn't really have any surprises either. I know like most of my family half of my family was born in England, so that was completely no surprise to get over 50% British Isles. So that's completely fine. But anyway, yeah. So no, that stuff is really interesting as far as knowing where you've come from and where the past is. Do you have any sort of any idea that are you more focusing on the Vikings and that sort of thing because that's got any sort of connection to your personal past or anything like that, or do you see that as important at all, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I love history from all different parts of the world. I mean, any historical topic I find very interesting. just about, but I've always had a great affinity with European history. I'd say it's definitely my favorite, and certainly Northern European history. So, Scandinavia, Germany, Finland, the British Isles, really those countries Iceland have interested me the most. And that's where, ancestrally I come from. Have a great deal of German in me, as many people do in Wisconsin, where I live. Of course, those Germans would have come over during really the age of immigration. So late 1800s, early 1900s. But yeah, I would say that that does have something to do with it. Just because knowing that these myths and these stories and these histories which I talk about are really sort of a part of who I am in a way as well.
I'll just preface this first of all. We have listeners who appreciate these stories from all over the world, and that's just absolutely fantastic. And I think the mythologies, especially the way we tackle them, they're accessible to everyone because they're just so universal, right? When you get right down to it. And so it's fantastic that anyone from any background is interested in literally anything, because it's, if you've got some kind of interest or that affinity, that's always fantastic. But I do think there really is something to, I mean, that's why I was interested in this stuff, like the Germanic religion, the Christian Germanic religion. I wanted to know about that. And being mostly from British Isles, for example, that leaves me closest to the Anglo-Saxon people. And we have a little bit less coming from Anglo-Saxon traditions than we do from Norse. And so Norse, there we go. That's the jumping off point. And well, I had no idea what kind of rabbit hole I was getting into with that one, and it's been a fun ride ever since. Oh, it's that's fantastic that you seem that you have that connection to something from your own past. And again, not that that would have been a prerequisite or anything, but I think that's something that Dan and I certainly share. So that's interesting that you as well have that perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
So, is there anything else that, since we last talked, that you've learned or that you particularly have found interesting that you might want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, writing the study guide for the Poetic Edda really gave me the opportunity to read the Poetic Edda cover to cover numerous times and comparing the different translations, namely that of Caroline Larrington and the more contemporary Dr. Jackson Crawford's translation. And one thing that's really cool about Larrington's translation is in the back of her book, she actually has an explanatory notes section, which is kind of a dictionary in it of itself, defining sort of these kennings, these obscure references, but also, if something's mentioned in this poem and then it's brought up again in another poem, but yet they're completely different, sort of which one is it, or should it be totally discarded or taken to heart? But, her explanatory notes section really inspired me to dig even deeper still into these many of the sagas and many of the skaldic poems when writing this book, The Poetic Edda, a study guide. So really just digging into these myths on such a deep level, I would say that's been one of the biggest things that I've learned about history, is probably yeah, writing the Poetic Edda, a study guide, and really learning about these poems and the origin of these poems as well in Iceland.
Have you, in your interviews, have you learned anything that's really blown your mind, or like, and it doesn't have to be like something that changed your life, but just something that you learned that was like, huh, I didn't know that, or like, or even these are some of my favorite things, like, wow, I can't believe humans have like did that at some point. That's weird.
Yeah, there's probably so much that I'm forgetting, but if it were brought up again, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's so interesting." I mean, just everything really. I've had the opportunity to interview on two occasions a professor from the University of Colorado Boulder a colleague of Dr. Jackson Crawford. That would be Dr. Matthias Nordvig. And we talked, one episode we did on the saga of Icelanders, and then another episode we did on the discovery and settlement of Viking Age Iceland. And really, everyone knows that the Vikings originated from Scandinavia and that they discovered and settled Iceland. But yet, most of the Old Norse literature we have does not come from Scandinavia. It comes from Iceland. So why is that? This idea of Iceland really being an exceptional place, it was very much the new world of the Viking Age. As I mentioned before, it's where we get all of the a great deal of the Norse myths and sort of these primary sources from. And Iceland gave us Snorri Sturluson, the acclaimed and distinguished Christian poet and historian. So, really looking at why was Iceland exceptional, and there's many theories to this. A lot of people would suggest it has something to do with the fact of immigration. This idea of societies migrating actually sort of affects them, obviously not genetically, but it really becomes a part of who they are. And you kind of see this in the United States as well when that was first discovered, because, not to really get into too much US history, but in the beginning there, in sort of like the when the United States was first became a nation, you really had this empire of wealth in a way, an empire that was not really like the old kingdoms of Europe. It didn't have massive armies, yet it was so colossally wealthy. Why is that? That's something exceptional in and of itself. And of course, the United States was and is a melting pot, directly related to migration as Iceland was. So just sort of comparing that was fascinating. I'm sure I'm forgetting a load of stuff, but man, yeah, that was really the discovery and settlement of Iceland was something that has really fascinated me lately.
That's certainly a huge point in the not only the history but the mythology, and of course where most of that mythology got written down. It's certainly one perspective from the mythologies, and so it's great that we also have different sources from other locations, but it's incredibly valuable that the Norse people of Iceland managed to write down their mythology, or else where would we all be here? We wouldn't have anything to look into. So certainly can be grateful to them for that. Well, I think, Noah, we'd like to let you tell our listeners how they can get a hold of you and anything else you might like to share with them as far as, how can they get your new book, anything else like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the opportunity to do that. Yes. So my podcast, The History of Vikings, is available anywhere you listen to your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play Music, so on and so forth. And my new book, The Poetic Edda, A Study Guide, is available on Amazon.com. Just type in The Poetic Edda Study Guide or type in my name, Noah Tetzner, and it'll come right up for you. Yeah, otherwise you can get in touch with me. My email is noah@thehistoryofvikings.com. So, and on Twitter, I'm at History of Vikings. I should say at History of Viking. And then on Instagram, it's just The History of Vikings.
Excellent. Well, it certainly has been fun talking with you, Noah. Really glad to have you on, and certainly hope to have you back as a regular guest, because it's always fun hearing what you're getting up to with the history of Vikings. And actually, it's been really excellent just getting to know not only you, but all the other hosts of the various related podcasts that we've had on. And it's great that we do these collaborations and we have each other on and have these great conversations. So I think I'll do just our usual how to get a hold of us. And I think before I do that, though, maybe just a quick shout out to some of the other folks who we have kind of gotten in contact with. I think that's a good time to do that. So there's Fjorn the Skald of Fjorn Hall. There's Siobhan Clark. She's got the Myths, Legends, and Lore podcast. There's Lee of the Viking Age podcast, and then there's the guys of Saga Thing. All these podcasts are fantastic, and certainly if you haven't given them a listen, feel free to check them out. I think you'll enjoy them if you like our show or if you like Noah's show. And as far as us, you can get a hold of us. We're on Twitter Instagram, Facebook, Northern Myths or Northern Myths Podcast. We're on Twitter personally, North Myth Luke and North Myth Dan. And we're also on YouTube. You can get a hold of us there. You can leave comments on our videos. And certainly, we always appreciate if you go visit our YouTube page, you give us a subscribe. That's certainly appreciated. And the other big news for us is that we have a Patreon page now. So if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so there, patreon.com/Northern Myths. We offer a few things to subscribers on Patreon, a little bit extra, some behind the scenes stuff from our recordings and our process sort of thing, as well as if you like to, you can subscribe to get episodes early. And we tend to deliver them 3 to 7 days early, depending on how ahead we are of the editing process. Although, of course, we leave open the possibility that Loki gets in the way and decides to make me scramble and be finishing up the editing the night before. That's unideal, but it happens. And with that, thank you again to Noah for coming on the show. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and we'll certainly have to have you on again. And Dan, is there anything I'm forgetting?
Well, I think you covered most of it, but there is one thing, and that's to go out and find the myth you're living.
This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thanks for listening.